Colonial time is never singular. The colonial occupation of space would be impossible without the simultaneous domination of time. According to Dan Tung Yang, the conquest of space is intrinsically tied to the mastery of time. The need to master time reveals that time is not given, but is constantly developed, patterned, and split. While much attention has been given to technologies that enable the conquest of space, it is important to consider colonial mechanisms that attempt the conquest of time. In the case of Imperial Russia, the Trans-Siberian Railway is a simple example of one such colonial mechanism. The railway exists as both physical infrastructure and a mechanism of temporal control. Throughout the 10,000-kilometer span of the railway, running through colonized territories, the station clock at each and every stop displayed the same time as in St. Petersburg. This universalized temporal order was an attempt to solidify the colonial conquest of space. As the example of the railway shows, infrastructures pattern time. In the words of Kyle Stein and Axel Wilmer, temporalities are hardwired. They are materialized within infrastructures. From the measurement and management of civilians to the synchronization of military systems, colonial regimes use time as a weapon. Colonial powers have developed a distinctive set of mechanisms to pacify populations through the use of time. However, an understanding of these mechanisms can reveal how time imposes its own rules on colonialism. Therefore, we understand colonialism as a complex system that encompasses temporal principles, both desirable and undesirable. With a focus on the Russian colonial regime, we will identify 4 of these temporal mechanisms. These are linearity, latency, recursion, and finitude.
Linear time is designed to conceal the colonial conquest of space. It forms a smokescreen made from the fantasies of the glorious future. Describing colonial invasion as a smooth movement towards progress provides the conditions for its possibility. Linear time creates utopic visions, forming a line from the glorious past towards an always distant future. Utopic dreams constantly produce frontiers. Frontiers is an essential elsewhere of linear time, a remote place where one would be happy. The triumphant arrival there is conditioned by imperial success in the past and the present. Outer space is a final frontier produced by the linearity of time. From the Cold War propaganda to the present-day billionaires, space travel has been portrayed as the highest stage of human progress, which combines technological innovation with the production of a distant world on which colonial fantasies of the future can be projected. The Soviet version of the outer space as the container of futurity is best manifested by the film Moscow Cassiopeia. Its plot revolves around a group of white teenagers moving smoothly through time and space to discover a new planet and find, and I quote, living and thinking creatures there. Their whole trip is based on the premise, the discovery of life in the yet-to-be-tamed outside would support human progress, moving the whole of humanity along the linear timeline. When a schoolgirl asks, why should we go to space when nature is destroyed here on Earth? The response she gets from one of the scientists frames the conquest of space as a part of an inevitable movement of human progress, which makes it an earthly problem. The conquest of the earthly space conditions the colonial visions of progress. Baikonur's spaceport, a mega infrastructure of the Soviet space launches, was built in the 1950s in present-day Kazakhstan by Russians. The dream of distant worlds concealed the literal conquest of land. The whole town was built to house the colonizers. By 1956, more than 2,500 people have moved to Baikonur. In the next 4 years, the colonial population multiplied 4 times. The linear and progress-based future of the conquest of outer space was designated solely to the Russian colonizers. The Soviet posters portrayed them as innovators and inventors, moving across worlds and centuries to put a red Soviet flag on top of a distant planet. As Deborah Cohen puts it, the infrastructures concretize futures. They manifest utopias in steel, concrete, and glass. Baikonur did just that. It displayed the linear progress as the Soviet state envisioned it, the conquest of frontiers, administered by Russian colonizers. After the dissolution of the USSR, its linear temporalities remained persistent, destroying the futures of the sovereign nation. Since 1994, the Baikonur spaceport has remained under the colonial control of the Russian state, which was masked by the notion of lease. It implies that to enter Baikonur, Kazakhstan citizens have to go through border control. It also means the ongoing destruction of human and non-human bodies by Russian space corporation Roscosmos. Due to the Russian control of the town, it is impossible to research to define the current scale of ecological destruction. The Russian state keeps reproducing the Soviet visions of progress, seasoning them with the new terms such as international space collaboration. The website of the Baikonur spaceport promises the conquest of Mars, Jupiter, and Moon in the near future. These promises allow for the maintenance of the Russian colonial control of Kazakhstan. In January 2022, during the protests in Kazakhstan, the Russian state justified its military invasion, calling it an anti-terrorist action aimed at the protection of the crucial infrastructure of Baikonur spaceport. The maintenance of linear time is thus based on the reproduction of colonial violence. "We have lost progress," uttered a speaker of Russian's channel after a cargo spacecraft Progress MC-04 failed to launch from Baikonur spaceport on December 3, 2016. The spaceship fell into pieces in the sky in Tver. An outdoor camera recorded moving dots in the sky, resembling falling stars. The video was removed from YouTube after the demand made by Roscosmos. The request for removal of a video is paralleled by the repeated claims that the catastrophe of a spaceship would not influence the local population of Tver. All of the pieces of the spaceship have reportedly burned in the atmosphere. The only available trace of failure is a picture of a snow-covered metal object publicized by the local authorities. Progress's failure is not the only moment when multiple metal objects fall from the sky. During every space launch, the stages of spaceship land on the ground. Multiple videos record large, rapid-moving rays of light in the sky. They light up the night sky with colorful lights and shine like 1,000 suns on a cloudy day. But where do they fall? After landing, the pieces of rockets turn into something like majestic ruins. The discovery of larger-than-human steel objects make the local news portraying the process of large-scale disposal, as if a disposal of a material object eliminated the violent effects of its presence. The ruins do not just appear out of the blue like rain on a sunny day. They are actively made by the colonial states. In Kazakhstan, the pieces of rockets launched from Baikonur spaceport land in nearby villages or in the steppe close to them. After the landing, they can cause fire or destroy people's homes. Christine Bechamel described them as space debris. Even if they don't cause immediate harm, they poison the everyday life of Kazakhstan with a never-ending Russian military invasion. The rocket fuel leaves residues on human and non-human bodies, contaminating lungs, nerves, soil, and water. The space debris create a violent intimacy. They get under people's skin, residing in bodies for generations to come. When launched from Baikonur spaceport, the rockets fly over the south of Siberia, the lands of multiple indigenous peoples, Altai, Khakassia, and Tver. As with Kazakhstan, the space debris create what Michelle Murphy describes as latency, the reemergence of past in the present through the intergenerational effects of colonialism. The slow effects of the rocket fuel on the human bodies pattern a non-linear temporality of constantly returning oppression. The more time passes, the more adverse effects get. After a rocket stage falls on the ground, an artificial cloud is formed. It consists of the evaporating rocket fuel mixed with gas and water. Then the atmospheric traces disappear. They re-emerge as illnesses which get worse with every next generation. The latency of space debris is concealed by the Russian state. The representatives of the National Health Department claim that the diseases of the indigenous Altai peoples are the consequences of what was described as lifestyle. The reasons include the accusations of the indigenous peoples in the heavy drinking, the consumption of low-quality food, and marriages between relatives. The latency of the space debris is concealed by the patronization of indigenous Altai people. It also creates a temporal division between the advanced technologies of space travel and the underdeveloped people who oppose their usage, standing in the way of an inevitable progress. This division is rooted in the nationalist politics of the Soviet state, which developed what Ariela Aish Azolai described as Imperial temporality. It was the diversification of people into the more and less developed, designed to obscure the violent industrialization. The formation of an Imperial temporality was masqueraded as the education of the racialist others done by the white Russian older brother. In Kazakhstan, it specifically targeted Islam, Soviet posters showed tractors driving towards progress and destroying the muleless mosques as the obstacles of progress. The imperial temporality of the Soviet state spanned across multiple localities, facilitating the colonial conquest of land and resources. Set in the Altai region, the film Golden Lake by Vladimir Schneiderov produces a Soviet imperial temporality with the figure of an evil shaman who fights a group of geologists who come to Altai region looking for gold to mine. The function of the film was to merge time and space. The land rich with resources was portrayed as inhabited by the underdeveloped colonial others. Latency, therefore, goes simultaneously in two directions. The colonial imposition of backwardness contaminates both the present and the future. Canceling the future to a lasting poison, it also incarcerates racialized subjects in the past. To rephrase Michelle Murphy, it creates an afterlife, a state of uncertainty, unevenly distributed in time.
Recursion. How can we envisage the end of such a complex entanglement of temporalities that constitutes colonialism? As we've discussed, linearity is a way for colonial rule to disguise itself as inevitable. Latency embodies how the long-lasting effects of colonialism contaminate both past and future. Both linearity and latency are efficient control mechanisms. However, there are other aspects of colonial time that are inherently self-defeating. I explore this through the concepts of recursion and finitude. Colonial warfare rests on the idea that it has tools to control time. Imperial powers like to think of themselves as massive machines that can bend time and space as they want. They imagine colonial invasions as fast battles to be won without much effort. Colonial regimes have developed an intricate sensorial apparatus, eyes and brains of missiles, drones, rifles, rovers, to impose speed. Thinkers of speed and acceleration follow the military lingua that believes in fast victories. What is described by Paul Virilli as dromology, the capacity to dominate the enemy through speed, has been called small wars by military thinkers since the 19th century. Such focus on speed misses the bigger pattern. These wars are recursive, even if fought fast. Racial superiority aspirations of quick victories face reality that the chances of colonial victory in these wars is around 1/3 or even less than that. According to several extensive surveys of colonial invasions by the infamous US military think tank RAND Corporation, it is as likely that the colonial invasion will be totally defeated as it is that it is going to be won. 30% of victories seems surprisingly low for what is presented as undefeatable war machine that has technological solutions for any problems that battlefield presents. Military budgets of Russia, Israel, USA, truly astronomical in size, somehow do not translate into power that would break the colonial resistance once and for all. To understand how these colonial wars are defeated, one should focus on recursion rather than speed. As Anne Laura Stoller suggested in her book on Imperial durabilities, recursion is not exactly the same as repetition of identical scenarios and mistakes. Recursion is redeployment, recombination of the tools and means of colonial violence. It corresponds to the etymology of the word time, время, in Russian. In Proto-Slavic, the word for time, vremen, meant something that spins, that comes back to its initial position. Such recursive spinning is very apparent in colonial wars. Colonial invasions spin in the same direction. The Soviet war in Afghanistan, waged from 1979 to 1989, despite all the enormous military resources thrown at it, was ultimately unsuccessful. It was spinning for a whole decade to come to the initial position. The same fate awaited Russia in its first invasion in Chechnya between 1994 and 1996. Technologies might change, but the tendency for the empire to be defeated remains. War criminals, weapons, strategies are quite literally redeployed from one war to another. They bring with them shortages, breaks, misconceptions that turn the tide of the conflict in the known direction. Colonial wars do not repeat themselves in the exact same manner, but they carry the ghosts of the past. And so, the dead of one war haunt the dead of another. Even though today's military personnel can see these ghosts through infrared goggles, their augmented senses do not protect them from specters. Instead, they welcome them into the same patterns of death. Death from friendly fire is the most telling example of how deaths repeat each other. Also referred to as fratricide, friendly fire is the act of troops accidentally killing each other. Unsurprisingly, it is a taboo subject in the military. Ironically, deaths from friendly fire are the result of military attempts to prevent future deaths. Ways to stop friendly fire are the ones to cause deaths in future battles. Despite being rarely discussed, for a colonial soldier to be killed by another colonial soldier is a common way to die. The numbers of those deaths are extremely underreported due to the danger they present for the colonial state. Accepting how widespread the friendly fire is will shake the core propaganda narratives essential for recruiting the soldiers and legitimizing these wars. Nevertheless, official reports estimate that friendly fire accounts for between 26 to 50% of all deaths in colonial forces. Soldiers acknowledge that friendly fire is part of everyday combat. One can see various traces of that. In 2008, when Russia launched a military aggression against Georgia, it lost 6 military jets, but only 3 of them were shot down by Georgian forces. The other half were downed by Russians themselves. Russian soldiers who invaded Afghanistan share how common the killings of fellow soldiers were. This is repeated in Russian accounts of the wars in Chechnya. On New Year's Day in 1995, 2 columns of Russian troops proceeded in parallel, storming through the streets of Grozny, killing each other while destroying the city. Deaths, the grim aftermath of colonial wars, do not have clear-cut beginnings and ends. As Karen Kaplan observed regarding the term aftermath, aftermath only recently gained the grim meaning of what is left after the war. Aftermath initially meant to obey the agricultural cycle. It meant cutting a second crop of grass to then be harvested. The math in aftermath is the act of mowing. As colonial powers deeply believe they have power to break the rhythmic cycles of war, they push themselves into more and more deadly traps. They state, I quote, that friendly fire is a curse. Military thinkers themselves admit that the friendly fire is a product of highly efficient industrialized war. Soldiers do not engage in hand-to-hand combat and, unlike less well-trained militaries, shoot at each other without looking or thinking twice. Colonial powers try to break the curse of death by making killing people more efficient, more deadly. It makes a circle. We start following this circle, they state. Friendly fire is caused by the fog of war, lack of reliable information on who is the enemy and where it is located. They throw more information at soldiers and their weapons, making them kill faster and more efficiently. Contemporary missiles, turned into the computers with explosives, speed up the pace of war. Instead of breaking the circle, they make the war cycle faster while broadcasting it on multiple screens. Assured by GPS and lasers, colonial soldiers now feel more confident to slaughter each other. Recursivity of imperial violence, as Anne Laura Stiller suggested, is marked by, I quote, contingent quality of histories that fold back on themselves and, in that refolding, reveal new surfaces and new planes, end of quote. It opens to novel possibilities ready to be seized by the colonial resistance. A Russian soldier who took part in the Second War in Chechnya in the late 90s recalls that guerrilla resistance actively staged friendly fire among Russian militaries. Russians, oblivious in their fantasies of savage Chechen warriors, could not believe that Chechen resistance were hacking their radio networks, broadcasting false fire positions in clear Russian. Confident in their drones, electronic weapons, and other regalia of technological superiority, Russians simply could not admit the fact that Chechen resistance was actively hacking them. And so, colonial wars spin in the same direction, and colonial troops still kill each other. And so, the histories of colonial assault folding on themselves from space for the struggle. Finitude. The other self-defeating aspect of colonial time besides recursion is its hardwired finitude. An empire is a finite structure. Colonialism is susceptible to temporal fragility. Its ends are certain. Nevertheless, its ends are multiple, as are the timescales they occupy. Is it possible to, in the words of Ariella Isha Azulay, envision beginnings and ends of colonialism? Time is a volatile construct, in which colonialism is not guaranteed eternity. Colonial regimes usually think of themselves as immune to the flow of time, but we are already familiar with the images of colonial projects decay. These images, appealing to viewers as ruin porn, have strong political meaning hidden behind their heavy aestheticization. Crimean nuclear power plant, one of such ruins, presents a promising case to look into their politics. Constructed by the Soviet state, it was never finished, assessed to be built on highly unstable ground. It is important that its construction was not stopped by geological, but political forces. The Russian state inflicting nuclear catastrophe on Ukraine in the Chernobyl disaster was scared of unrest. One can imagine the reaction of the Soviet state that the Soviet state would get by planting another nuclear ticking bomb on Ukrainian soil. With the end of Soviet government, this ruin was appropriated by the Ukrainian and international youth. It was used in 1998 for the rave of one of the most popular post-Soviet festivals, Kazantip, which with every year became even more mainstream. Dancing bodies in one's failed attempts of colonial conquest is one telling example of colonial finitude. What is important about finitude? If we're attentive to its patterns and fluctuations, we can welcome the obsolescence of colonialism. By enhancing the waves that cross the fabric of time, we can actively destabilize colonial regimes. The etymology of Russian word time, время, contains the traces of these waves. Recursive времен, with its meaning of time spinning in circles, which we talked about earlier, switched to время. Время focuses the definition of time on its temporary nature, showing it as volatile and transitory. Время means an interim swath of time, far from having any connotations of eternity. One of the central technologies that sustain colonial regimes are their infrastructures. They have patterns of time hardwired in them. Bridges, railroads, internet cables, ports, roads, cellular towers are essential for the colonial authorities to radiate and enforce their power. Colonial infrastructures control the flow of critical commodities like people and information. Being the heart of the empire, they are meant to be protected from any possible threat. These threats range from decolonial resistance to militant anarchists, but do not tend to include time. Let's take a closer look at colonial infrastructures. As we can see from the movements of the military bridge, offensive military infrastructures never pretend to be durable. Despite facilitating enormous flows of colonial power, they're explicitly built to be dismantled and taken away to follow the invasion. This comes in contrast with settler colonial infrastructures usually portrayed to stay functional for centuries. These infrastructures are usually presented to last for inhumane spans of time, despite being as volatile and transitory as military ones. Let's take as an example the Crimean Bridge, erected by Russia to cement annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. The Crimean Bridge, that currently allows direct movement between the peninsula and Russia, is stated to last for more than 100 years. Such a number is not objective, rather it is a political tool meant to hide the temporal fragility of infrastructure. Temporal fragility is a constant need of infrastructures in maintenance and repair to stop their decay, analyzed by Kavita Ramakrishnan, Kathleen O'Reilly, and Jessica Budd. Similarly to the military bridge dismantled to follow colonizers, the civilian bridge of settlers needs constant maintenance and repair to prevent its dismantling. Roads, bridges, buildings that comprise colonial settlement will decay and crumble without a constant influx of labor supporting their existence. They are no less mobile and temporary than military infrastructures are. We tend to think of them otherwise because settler colonialism tries to camouflage itself on a different temporal scale. Settler colonialism tries to hide itself in time to last for long enough to stay beyond comprehension. Settler colonialism weaponizes time to obscure its finitude. Finitude is hardwired into colonialism. However, this does not mean that colonialism will end by itself. Linearity and latency are powerful and efficient mechanisms which can only be countered by the logic of recursion and finitude. These temporal mechanisms can activate hardwired obsolescence and bring about the ends of colonial time.